Today I'm going to show you how to take the basic tubular knitted hat pattern that was shown in a previous video and shape the top of the crown as you see was done in this hat. This hat also has a ribbed hem rather than the rolled or crocheted hem, and that's the subject of another video. The shaping occurs at the edges of the tube and ends up on the real hat in the two places that are marked. The area between them is either seamed or grafted to finish the top of the crown. In the last movie, I was making 16-inch hats, roughly a toddler-sized hats. I will make these 18 inches so you get some variety of sizes. That fits a small to medium child, depending on how people like it to fit. On that subject, hats either fit the exact circumference of the head or with negative ease, 1 to 2 inches smaller. So that's why there's a range, because there's personal taste there. Also because not every 4-year-old is exactly the same size as every other 4-year-old. I have found the standards on the Craft Yarn Council website pretty accurate. They divide head sizes into preemie, baby, toddler, child, tween, so we know that child is only going up to 10 or so, adult woman, and adult man. So 18 inches is what they say a child size, and that is probably between the ages of 3 and 10 that we're talking about, likely to get a good fit here. For the basics concerning setting up for tubular knitting, the use of waste yarn if you want to knit a strip of hats, and everything to do with the basic hat, you'll want to view this video. I'm not going to repeat it all here because the tubular knitting is just the same, and we want to focus on the crown. I will place a link in the program notes so that you can find the easiest knitted tubular hat video easily. I'm still using inexpensive worsted weight, that is number 4 yarn, getting 4 stitches, 6 rows per inch. The crown shaping is going to take place over 24 rows. I want to knit 60 rows total, so that means 36 rows on the counter of plain old tubular knitting. This hat must either be knitted as a single or final hat in a long strip, which is what I'm doing, because in order to accomplish the shaping, we have to change stitch numbers, and that fact means this style doesn't lend itself to being in the middle of a strip of hats. I changed colors before getting to the crown area for 2 reasons. First of all, I'm using odds and ends, and I ran out of the one I was working on. But I also planned to make it white so that you can see what's going on better than you could in that variegated yarn. If the edges give you any trouble, don't forget to use some weights at the edges of the work. When 36 rows are complete, we begin doing the crown shaping by decreasing 1 stitch on each bed on each side every 2 rows. I've filmed in such a way that you can see me decreasing on the right side quite well. You'll have to take my word for the fact that I'm doing the identical thing on the left side. The simple decrease works just fine. In other words, move the edge stitch in one needle and put the empty needle out of work. Decreasing on the front bed, the rubber bed, takes some getting used to. I'm going to try to do some of these decreases left-handed so that you can see a little bit better what's going on. There was the main bed decrease. Here comes the river bed decrease. Make sure you get the stitch off neatly and fully seated on the next needle over. Knitters who aren't very tall don't have a very good angle of view of whether that stitch is seated on the river bed. So it may be worth tipping your head side to side or even standing up briefly to make sure that the stitch did get seated. Another pitfall is that it is easy to leave a needle far enough forward on its bed that it will engage and try to pick up the stitch and knit the next row, defeating the whole purpose. So be meticulous about putting them out of work once they're emptied. We will repeat this process 12 times, that process being knit 2 rows, which is really 1 round, decrease 1 on each end of each bed, and repeat. While I continue to decrease, let me explain how to figure out the decreases. You basically want 1/3 of the original stitches left on each bed when the shaping is complete. In this case, that was really easy. I had 36 stitches on each bed. Divide that by 3. I want 12 left, so we have 12 decreases needed on each side. That is going to take 24 rows. Simple. It would not have come out as neatly if I were knitting with 40 stitches, and it doesn't have to be perfect. If I decreased over the course of 26 rows, so there were 13 decreases on each side, it would leave 14 in the middle, which would be okay. Or you could do 14 and 14 and leave 12 stitches in the middle. It's not critical that this be absolutely perfect to get the pleasant effect of the shaping. What is important is that you do achieve the total row count you were aiming for, which will be different for different sizes of hats. Should you feel that you don't want to do the math, don't worry about it. I'll be writing up the pattern in multiple sizes for Country Knitting of Maine News and Views. It will be in quite a few sizes, and you won't have to do any math. When 12 decreases have been made on each side, knit 2 more rows. Again, that's still just one complete round. And it's time to finish the top of the hat. And here you have the choice of binding off and seaming, as was shown in the previous movie, or of transferring all the main bed stitches to the back bed and binding off, in which case the seam will show on the outside of the fabric, or scrapping off and grafting the top shut. And that's the one I'm going to choose because you haven't seen grafting on the top of a hat yet. Here I left a generous yarn tail so that I can use it to perform the grafting, and now I'll scrap off. If at all possible, pick a waste yarn that is in stark color contrast to the main yarn. That's going to make your separation and the grafting process both much easier. There's our shaped crown. Now we tuck the waste yarn inside the hat and graft the few stitches left together, and the seam will be nearly invisible. Start by coming up through the first stitch on the opposite side from where the yarn tail emerges. And please forgive my garden stained hands. I do scrub, but it doesn't always produce the ideal results. Down, up through the next stitch. What we do is go down through the stitch we stitched into on the previous trip across, and up for the first time through a new stitch. Then we switch to the opposite side and do the same again. I do have an entire movie on grafting with reference to socks, and this is the same process. So if you need to understand it better, you may want to go look for that movie. Keep the waste yarn tucked inside. We'll pull it out later, and it will allow us to work into these stitches without losing them. As we progress across, the work gets a little bit easier because the seam is forming and it starts to help the hat keep its shape. Now all that remains is to pull out the waste yarn and weave in the final yarn tail. If you used a row of ravel cord, a round of ravel cord actually, 2 rows on the row counter, then you can just tug your ravel cord out. I didn't bother with it. I'm using up swatches as my waste yarn, so I'm needing to unravel. That's not very difficult. And here's what happens if you accidentally stitch into your waste yarn. No biggie, I'll have to snip it, but that's why we try to avoid doing this. The seam is barely visible, and it also hugs the top of the skull much more tightly than a gathered crown will do. No wrinkles. The next couple of videos in this series will address 2 different ways to get ribbing on the bottom of the hat.